The Battle of Willow Pond. Tom Harper had always found solace in the quiet rhythms of his farm. The creak of the porch swing, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the gentle lapping of water against the edge of Willow Pond. It was a symphony of peace he'd spent years cultivating. At 52, with calloused hands and a sun-weathered face, he'd learned patience from the land. Crops didn't rush, seasons didn't bend to whims, and neither did he. But that morning, as he stepped outside with Max, his old golden retriever, the harmony shattered. He'd been mourning his father's passing, a quiet, private grief, and had taken to walking the property each dawn to steady himself. The pond, a shimmering gem nestled at the edge of his fields, had been his father's pride. Ducks floated lazily across its surface, fish darted beneath, and dragonflies skimmed the water like living jewels. It was a sanctuary. Until now. Tom froze mid-step, his breath catching as his eyes locked onto the pond. What had once been crystal clear was now a grotesque mockery, a floating landfill of garbage. Plastic bottles bobbed like buoys, greasy fast food wrappers clung to the reeds, and, absurdly, a half-deflated pool float shaped like a flamingo spun slowly in the center, its pink plastic glaring against the murk. Max trotted forward, sniffing a takeout container that drifted near the shore, then looked back at Tom with a tilt of his head, as if asking, "What happened here?" Tom's heart thudded, a mix of disbelief and fury rising in his chest. He knelt by the water's edge, his boots sinking into the damp soil, and spotted something that made his blood run cold, a soggy bundle of papers, half submerged near the bank. He reached in, grimacing as cold water soaked his sleeve, and pulled it free. The ink was smudged, but the words were still legible. An Oak Ridge community newsletter, the mouthpiece of the nearby homeowners association. And right on top, in bold print, was a name, Lydia Grayson. His hands clenched into fists, the wet paper crumpling in his grip. Of course it was her. Lydia, the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Ridge, had been a thorn in his side since she'd moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago. Her sprawling McMansion overlooked his farm, and she'd made it clear from day one that his rustic life offended her polished sensibilities. She'd filed complaints about his chickens clucking too loudly, demanded he chop down a row of ancient oaks because they blocked her view, and once tried to strong-arm the county into forcing him to modernize his barn. Tom had weathered it all with the same patience he gave his crops. But this was war. He shook the muck off the papers and stood, his jaw tight. Max whined softly, sensing the shift in his master's mood. "Don't worry, boy," Tom muttered, rubbing the back of his neck to ease the tension. "We're gonna fix this." Farming had taught him to bide his time, to wait for the right moment. But seeing his pond, his father's pond, desecrated ignited something primal, a slow-burning rage he hadn't felt in years. Lydia had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it stand. By noon, Tom had worked himself into a plan. He grabbed a burlap sack from the barn, marched back to the pond, and started collecting the evidence, every bottle, wrapper, and scrap of paper he could reach. The flamingo float he left spinning. It felt like a fitting centerpiece to her crime. With the sack slung over his shoulder and Max trotting at his heels, he set off for the Oak Ridge meeting hall. He'd rehearsed the confrontation a dozen times in his head, each version sharper than the last. Lydia might think she ruled the world from her cappuccino-sipping throne, but today, she'd learn otherwise. The meeting hall was a stark contrast to his farm, polished floors, glass doors, and air that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Tom's muddy boots thudded against the wood as he pushed inside, drawing startled glances from the handful of board members scattered around the long conference table. Lydia sat at the head, as always, sipping her coffee with the dainty precision of someone who'd never lifted a shovel in her life. Her blonde hair was swept into a perfect bun, her nails gleaming red against the cup. She didn't look up until Tom stopped in front of her. Without a word, he appended the sack. Soda cans clattered, plastic bags crinkled, and the soaked newsletter landed with a wet slap right in front of her. Gasps rippled through the room. Lydia blinked, then wrinkled her nose, pushing the mess away with a manicured finger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "What is this?" Tom crossed his arms, his voice steady but edged with steel. "That's what I'd like to know. Seems someone decided my pond was their personal dumpster. And funny thing, This was in the mix. He tapped the newsletter, watching her face for a crack in her composure. Her expression flickered. Not guilt. No, Lydia didn't do guilt, but irritation, like he was a fly buzzing too close. She sighed dramatically. Tom, honestly, I have no idea how that got there. Could have been anyone. Teenagers, maybe, sneaking onto your land. Teenagers, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. Sure. Teenagers just happened to grab a stack of HOA paperwork and dump it in my pond, along with a week's worth of trash. She shrugged, unfazed. Who knows? Let's be real. It's not like that pond is some luxury feature. It's just she waved a hand dismissively. A muddy little swamp, isn't it? Tom smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the room shift uneasily. Lydia should have been nervous, but she was too busy sipping her coffee to notice. He leaned forward, his voice low. You really should have done your homework before saying that, Lydia. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. She twitched, just slightly, a crack in her armor. Tom straightened, savoring the moment. That muddy little swamp is a protected ecosystem under state law. You didn't just litter. You violated environmental regulations. And that comes with fines. Her face paled for a heartbeat before she recovered, flipping her hair with a scoff. Oh, please. You're just trying to scare me. Am I? He pulled out his phone and turned it toward her. A photo of the pond, covered in garbage, glowed on the screen, attached to an official complaint he'd already filed. Reported it this morning. The environmental office doesn't mess around. They'll investigate, and when they do, they won't just come for the person responsible, they'll come for the whole HOA. A chair scraped as a board member, Greg, a wiry man with glasses, shot to his feet. Wait, what? Is this true? Tom nodded. They take this stuff seriously. Could be thousands in fines. Greg turned to Lydia, his voice sharp. Tell me you didn't do this. She forced a laugh, but it was brittle. I mean, even if I did, it's just a little trash. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. Tom tilted his head. Funny. I remember you losing your mind when I left a pile of firewood too close to the property line. But dumping garbage in a pond? That's fine, huh? The room went quiet, all eyes on Lydia. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, she looked cornered. Tom stepped back, letting the weight of his words settle. He'd planted the seed. Now he'd watch it grow. Tom walked out of the meeting hall with Max at his side, the cool afternoon air a welcome relief from the tension inside. He didn't need to stay for the aftermath. He'd seen the board members' faces shift from shock to anger, and that was enough. Lydia's reign of petty tyranny was cracking, and he'd lit the fuse. As he scratched Max behind the ears, he muttered, Let's see how she wiggles out of this one, huh? He didn't waste time. Back at the farm, he dialed Dave Sullivan, an old friend who'd spent the last decade working as an environmental officer for the county. Dave had a no-nonsense streak and a knack for dealing with people who thought rules didn't apply to them. When Tom explained the situation, Lydia, the pond, the HOA newsletter, Dave let out a low whistle through the phone. So, let me get this straight, Dave said, amusement lacing his voice. This woman dumped her HOA trash in your pond and then admitted in front of witnesses that she doesn't think it's a big deal. Pretty much, Tom replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. Right there in the meeting hall, bold as brass. Dave laughed, sharp and gleeful. Oh, she's gonna regret that. Give me a couple days, I'll swing by and check it out. If it's as bad as you say, this isn't just littering. It's an environmental hazard. Tom smirked. Good. Make it sting. 2 days later, Dave pulled up in his county truck, clipboard in hand, and a team of 2 assistants trailing behind. Tom met them at the pond, where the garbage still floated in a mocking tableau. The flamingo float had drifted to one side, its beak dipping into the water like it was taking a nap. Max trotted along the shore, sniffing curiously, but Tom waved him back. Stay out of it, boy. Dave surveyed the mess, his grin fading into a frown. This isn't just trash, Tom. You've got food containers breaking down, plastics leaching chemicals. Could be toxic runoff if we don't clean it up fast. I'd say this qualifies as a hazard. Even better, Tom said, crossing his arms. What's that mean for her? Big fines, Dave replied, scribbling notes. And if the HOA's tied to it, they'll feel it too. I'll file the report today. Trust me, she's not slipping out of this. By the end of the week, the official paperwork hit. Lydia was slapped with a $10,000 cleanup bill, plus penalties if she didn't act fast. The HOA got its own notice, since the trash bore their letterhead. Tom didn't have to wait long for the fireworks. At the next Oak Ridge meeting, he arrived just as voices spilled out from the hall, Lydia's shrill protests cutting through the din. He stepped inside, and the room went still. Lydia, red-faced and furious, jabbed a trembling finger at him. "You did this. You're trying to ruin me." Tom raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I didn't dump trash in my own pond, Lydia. That was all you." An older board member, Henry, sighed and rubbed his temples. "Lydia, this is serious. The HOA's tangled up in an environmental case because of you. We can't afford this." She scoffed, tossing her hair. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. We can just ignore it. They won't enforce it." Tom's smirk widened. "They will. And if you don't pay, it'll escalate. Lawyers, court, maybe a lawsuit against the HOA. I'm sure your neighbors would love that." Her bravado faltered, but she doubled down. "You're exaggerating. It's just a stupid pond." The room erupted, half the board demanding she pay out of pocket, the other half horrified at the HOA's liability. Lydia argued it wasn't her fault, that everyone dumps a little trash now and then. Tom leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching the chaos unfold. She was digging her own grave, and he didn't need to say another word. After an hour of shouting, the board ruled. Lydia would fund the cleanup herself, or she'd be ousted from the HOA. Tom left before the vote finalized, but he didn't need to stick around. He'd won this round. The next morning, Tom sipped coffee on his porch, watching a scene he'd never dreamed of. Lydia Grayson, knee-deep in Willow Pond, wearing designer rain boots now caked in mud. A few HOA members stood on the shore, arms crossed, as she gagged and yanked out plastic bags and soggy wrappers. She flung a bloated cardboard box onto the bank, whining, "This is disgusting. I shouldn't have to do this." Henry, the board member, stared at her flatly. "You dumped it, you clean it." Tom strolled over, coffee in hand, and caught Ellen Carter's eye. The older woman, who'd never liked Lydia, smirked over her tea. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day." "Me neither," Tom said, grinning. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, Lydia's miserable expression framed perfectly against the murky water. He didn't plan to post it, but someone else did. By afternoon, a video of her cleanup tantrum, complete with dramatic gags and complaints, hit the neighborhood group chat. By evening, it was viral. The internet dubbed her Trash Queen Lydia, adding slow-motion zooms and captions about instant karma. Tom couldn't help but laugh as he scrolled through the memes on his phone that night. Max sprawled at his feet. "Guess she's famous now, huh, boy?" A few days later, an envelope arrived. Not the usual HOA nonsense, but a check for $10,000 and a note. "Thanks for finally humbling her. I should have done it years ago." Mark Grayson, Lydia's husband. Tom stood on his porch, shaking his head in disbelief. Even her own household was done with her. Tom Harper leaned against his porch railing, a mug of black coffee warming his hands as the morning sun crept over the horizon. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint tang of the pond's lingering cleanup. Max sprawled beside him, gnawing lazily on a stick, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the wooden planks. It had been 3 days since Lydia Grayson's humiliating pond cleaning spectacle, and the neighborhood was still buzzing. Tom hadn't expected the video to spread so fast, or so far, but now Trash Queen Lydia was the talk of Oak Ridge and beyond. He sipped his coffee, replaying the image of Lydia knee-deep in muck, her designer boots ruined, her face twisted in disgust. It was satisfying, sure, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Lydia wasn't the type to slink away quietly. She'd fight, claw, and scream her way back to relevance if she could. Tom had known mules less stubborn. His phone buzzed on the railing. A text from Ellen Carter, the sharp-tongued widow who lived 2 houses down from Lydia. "HOA meeting tonight. Rumor is she's rallying her loyalists. You coming?" Tom smirked. He hadn't planned to, but the thought of watching Lydia squirm some more was tempting. "Wouldn't miss it," he typed back. By evening, he'd swapped his work boots for a clean pair and headed to the meeting hall, Max trotting beside him until he left the dog on the porch with a pat. Inside, the air crackled with tension. The room was packed, More people than Tom had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Lydia sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of forced composure. Her hair was still perfect, her nails freshly painted, but there was a brittleness to her now, like a vase one tap away from shattering. Henry, the board member who'd ordered her cleanup, stood to address the crowd. "We're here to discuss the environmental violation tied to Willow Pond," he began, his voice weary. "The fine's been issued, $10,000 to Lydia, plus potential penalties for the HOA if we don't comply. We need to decide how to handle this." Lydia shot to her feet, cutting him off. "This is absurd. I've already been humiliated, forced to wade through that disgusting swamp like some servant. I cleaned it up, didn't I? This should be done." Tom, leaning against the back wall, raised an eyebrow. The room murmured, some in agreement, others in disbelief. Ellen, seated near the front, snorted loud enough to draw glares. "Cleaned it up?" she called out. "You whined the whole time and left half the trash floating. I've got the video to prove it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Lydia's face flushed crimson. "That video is a smear campaign," she snapped. "This is harassment. Tom's behind it, trying to ruin me." All eyes turned to Tom. He didn't flinch. "I didn't make you dump trash in my pond, Lydia. And I didn't film you throwing a tantrum about it. That's on you." She jabbed a finger at him. "You reported it. You escalated this to some environmental nonsense just to spite me." "No," Tom said calmly. "I reported it because you broke the law. You're lucky it's just a fine and not a lawsuit." Henry banged a fist on the table. "Enough. Lydia, the board's already decided you're paying the cleanup costs. The question now is whether you stay on this board. Your actions put us all at risk." A woman near the back, Clara, one of Lydia's few remaining allies, stood. "She's been a strong leader. This is one mistake. We shouldn't overreact." "Overreact?" Greg, the wiry accountant, shot back. "The HOA could be liable for thousands more if the county digs deeper. She's a liability." The room erupted into chaos, shouts, accusations, and the occasional plea for calm. Lydia tried to regain control, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I've kept this neighborhood pristine. You all benefited from my rules, my vision. This is a witch hunt." Tom watched, arms crossed, as her vision unraveled. Her loyalists were dwindling, and the board's patience was gone. After an hour of debate, Henry called for a vote. "All in favor of removing Lydia Grayson from the board, raise your hands." Hands shot up, more than Tom expected. Clara and two others abstained, but the majority was clear. Lydia's mouth fell open, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "You can't do this," she screeched. "I built this HOA. You trashed it," Ellen muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Henry sighed. "It's done. Lydia, you're out. We'll handle the fine with the county, but you're on your own for the cleanup bill." She stormed out, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled. Tom stayed until the meeting adjourned, then stepped outside to find Max waiting, tail wagging. "Well, boy," he said, scratching the dog's ears, "that's one less headache." But as he walked home under the starlit sky, he knew Lydia wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd lost her throne, but her pride was still intact, for now. The next morning, Tom woke to a flood of notifications on his phone. The Trash Queen Lydia video had exploded overnight, jumping from neighborhood group chats to social media platforms across the county. Someone had added dramatic music, a swelling orchestral track that peaked as Lydia flung a soggy burger wrapper onto the shore. Another version slowed her gagging into a comedic loop, captioned "When Karma Hits Hard." By noon, it had thousands of views, shares, and comments, most of them gleeful jabs at the entitled HOA lady. Tom sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the chaos with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Max rested his head on Tom's knee, whining for a scrap of bacon. "You're famous now too, huh?" Tom said, tossing him a piece. He hadn't meant for this to go so far, but he wasn't sorry either. Lydia had spent years making his life hell. Let her taste a little of her own medicine. Ellen called around lunchtime, her voice brimming with glee. "You seen the news? Channel 5 wants to do a segment on it. Local woman's trash tantrum goes viral. They're calling her the poster child for HOA overreach." Tom chuckled. "She's gonna hate that." "Oh, she already does," Ellen said. I heard she's been screaming at the station over the phone, demanding they drop the story. Threatened to sue, even. Good luck with that, Tom said. She's got bigger problems. He was right. That afternoon, Dave Sullivan dropped by the farm, his county truck kicking up dust as it rolled down the drive. Tom met him at the pond, where the water was starting to clear, though the flamingo float still bobbed defiantly in the center. Dave grinned, clipboard in hand. Reports filed. Fines official, $10,000, plus a mandate for full restoration. And since the HOA's linked, they're under scrutiny too. Tom nodded. How's that going to play out? They'll distance themselves fast, Dave said. Probably pin it all on Lydia to avoid collective liability. I've seen it before. Boards turn on their own when the heat's on. Sure enough, the HOA wasted no time. By evening, a notice went out to all Oak Ridge residents. The board condemns the actions of former member Lydia Grayson and is cooperating fully with county authorities. Cleanup costs will not fall on the HOA. Tom read it on his porch, Max snoring beside him, and let out a low whistle. She's really on her own now. The viral storm didn't let up. Over the next few days, memes multiplied, Lydia's face photoshopped onto trash cans, flamingos, even a crown made of garbage bags. A local radio station ran a segment called Trash Talk, dissecting her downfall with call-in listeners who'd had their own HOA horror stories. Tom stayed out of it, content to let the internet do its work, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction. Every snide complaint she'd ever lobbed at him, about his barn, his trees, his hillbilly lifestyle, was coming back to haunt her. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a quiet Saturday, tucked among the usual bills and flyers. Tom opened it absently, expecting another HOA update, but froze when he saw the contents. A check for $10,000 and a handwritten note. Thanks for finally humbling her. I should have done it years ago. Mark Grayson. He stared at it, then laughed out loud, the sound startling Max awake. Her own husband, Tom said, shaking his head. Didn't see that coming. He tucked the check into his wallet, unsure what to do with it yet. Cashing it felt like a final twist of the knife, but part of him wondered if Mark was serious or just desperate to keep the peace. Either way, it was another crack in Lydia's crumbling empire. By the end of the week, the news segment aired. Tom watched it with Ellen at her house, a bowl of popcorn between them. The anchor, a perky brunette, stood by Willow Pond, clean now, save for that stubborn flamingo, recapping the saga with a mix of humor and mock sympathy. Lydia Grayson's trash troubles have made her a cautionary tale for HOA leaders everywhere, she said, cutting to footage of Lydia's cleanup meltdown. Ellen cackled as the camera zoomed in on Lydia's horrified face. She's never living this down, Ellen said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Tom grinned. Nope. And I'm just getting started. Lydia's fall wasn't loud or dramatic after that. It was a slow, quiet retreat. The HOA's rejection and the viral humiliation stripped her of her armor, leaving her exposed and powerless. Tom noticed the change over the next week. Her car stayed parked in the driveway, her curtains stayed drawn, and the usual strut she'd carried through Oak Ridge was gone. She'd become a ghost in her own kingdom. Tom didn't gloat, not outwardly. He went about his days as always, tending the farm, walking Max by the pond, and keeping an eye on the water as it gradually healed. The cleanup Lydia had half done wasn't enough. Dave's team had finished the job, hauling out the last of the garbage and testing the water for contamination. The flamingo float was finally gone, a small victory Tom savored more than he'd admit. But the neighborhood wasn't the same. Without Lydia's constant meddling, her rules about lawn height, paint colors, and appropriate mailbox designs, people relaxed. Tom ran into Greg at the hardware store one morning, the accountant looking less harried than usual. You know, Greg said, hefting a bag of mulch. I didn't realize how much she stressed us all out until she was gone. Tom nodded. Funny how one person can sour a whole place. She's not gone yet, Greg said, lowering his voice. Heard she's fighting the fine, trying to appeal it with the county. Says it's unfair. Tom snorted. She can try. Dave says it's ironclad. Greg grinned. Good. Maybe she'll finally learn. That afternoon, a group of HOA members showed up at Tom's gate. Henry, Clara, and a woman named Sarah, who'd always stayed neutral in the Lydia wars. They shuffled awkwardly, hands in pockets, until Henry spoke. "We've been talking," he said. "Your pond, it's a beautiful spot. We were wondering if you'd consider letting us turn it into something for the community. Not public, just a fishing spot, maybe a picnic area. Something nice." Tom blinked, caught off guard. "You serious?" "Yeah," Sarah said. "After all this mess, we figured it'd be a way to, I don't know, make things right." He scratched his jaw, glancing at Max, who wagged his tail as if in approval. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "No promises." They nodded, relieved, and left him to mull it over. The idea wasn't bad. He'd kept the pond pristine for years, not just for himself, but for the ducks, the fish, the whole ecosystem his father had loved. Sharing it could work, if they respected it. A few days later, he met with an environmental specialist Dave recommended, a wiry woman named Rachel who knew wetlands like the back of her hand. She walked the pond's edge with him, taking notes as he explained his concerns. "We can make it work," she said. "Light use, fishing, picnics. Won't hurt the ecosystem if we set rules. No trash, no motorized boats, regular cleanups." Tom liked her no-nonsense tone. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." Word spread fast. By the next week, volunteers were clearing brush around the pond, setting up benches, and plotting a small dock. Tom supervised, making sure they stuck to Rachel's plan. It felt strange, seeing his sanctuary transform, but it also felt right, like a new chapter. Lydia, meanwhile, faded further. Ellen reported seeing her peering through her curtains, watching the pond project with a scowl, but she never came out to complain. Then, one morning, Tom spotted it, a for sale sign in her yard. He paused mid-step, Max bumping into his leg, and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." The neighborhood whispered about it all day. Some said she was moving to a new HOA where she could start over. Others figured she was fleeing the shame of her viral infamy. Tom didn't care why. She was leaving, and that was enough. The moving trucks arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, their engines rumbling through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge. Tom stood by his fence, a thermos of coffee in hand, watching as Lydia's overpriced furniture was loaded up, her gaudy sectional, her crystal chandelier, her collection of abstract art no one else understood. Max sat beside him, ears perked, as if sensing the shift in the air. Lydia emerged from the house, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her usual polish replaced by a tired slump. She spotted Tom across the yard and froze. Their eyes met, and for a moment, he thought she'd say something, yell, accuse, or just sneer like old times. But she didn't. She looked away, climbed into her car, and drove off without a word. Tom exhaled, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lifting from his shoulders. "That's that, huh, boy," he said to Max, who barked once in agreement. Ellen called him later, her voice giddy. "She's really gone. Packed up and peeled out like the devil was chasing her. You should have seen the look on her face when the movers scratched her dining table." Tom laughed. "Wish I'd caught that." "Mark stayed behind," Ellen added. "Heard he's filing for divorce. Guess he's keeping the house." Tom thought of the check and the note. "Thanks for finally humbling her," and shook his head. "Makes sense." The pond project moved forward, and by the end of the month, Willow Pond was unrecognizable in the best way. The dock was finished, benches lined the shore, and a sign declared it Willow Pond Community Space. No trash allowed. Tom hosted a barbecue to celebrate, firing up his old grill while neighbors brought sides and kids ran around with fishing poles. It was the first time in years Oak Ridge felt like a real community, not a battlefield. As the sun set, Tom sat in his rocking chair, watching the water reflect the fading light. Max dozed at his feet, and the laughter of families filled the air. Lydia was gone, her reign a memory, and the pond was thriving. It was more than he'd hoped for. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm after Lydia's departure. The HOA, under Henry's steady hand, dropped its petty rules and focused on practical matters: road repairs, a community garden, keeping the pond clean. Tom found himself nodding to neighbors he'd barely spoken to before, their smiles genuine now that the shadow of Lydia's tyranny was gone. He cashed Mark's check, using it to fund a water filtration system for the pond, a quiet nod to the man who'd thanked him for ending the chaos. Mark stopped by one day, a sheepish grin on his face. "Didn't think you'd cash it," he said. "Didn't think you'd send it," Tom replied. They shared a laugh, and Mark promised to join the next fishing day at the pond. The viral storm faded, replaced by new internet obsessions, but Trash Queen Lydia lingered as a local legend. Kids dared each other to reenact her cleanup tantrum, and Ellen kept a framed meme on her mantle. Tom let it go, content with the quiet. One evening, as winter crept in, Tom walked the pond's edge with Max, the air sharp with frost. He thought about his father, who'd taught him to love this land, and how proud he'd be to see it now, a place of peace, not war. Lydia had thought she could bend the world to her will, but nature, and a little patience, had balanced the scales. He didn't know where she'd gone, and he didn't care. She'd lost everything she'd clung to: power, pride, control, and he'd gained more than he'd sought. Justice, he figured, didn't always need a fist. Sometimes it just needed time. Spring brought new life to the pond. Ducks returned, fish splashed, and families gathered on weekends. Tom sat on his porch, watching it all, Max graying but still wagging his tail. The battle with Lydia felt like a distant dream, its scars healed by the community that had risen in her wake. He'd won, not just against her, but for something bigger. Willow Pond wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs. And that, he thought, was the best kind of victory.